Welcome to the 12th hearing of the Public Accountability Committee's inquiry into the appointment of Mr John Barilaro as Senior Trade Investment Commissioner to the Americas. The inquiry is examining the circumstances leading up to the appointment of the various commissioners, including the processes, probity and integrity measures undertaken. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians on the lands on which we are meeting today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Today, we'll be hearing from one witness, Ms Kylie Bell, Managing Director, Investment, New South Wales. I thank the witness for making the time to give evidence to this important inquiry. Before we commence, I'd like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. Today's hearing is being broadcast live via the Parliament's website. A transcript of today's hearing will be placed on the committee's website when it becomes available. In accordance with the broadcasting guidelines, the House has authorised the filming, broadcasting and photography of committee proceedings by representatives of media organisations from any position in the room and by any member of the public from any position in the audience. Any person filming or photographing proceedings must take responsibility for the proper use of that material. This is detailed in the broadcasting resolution, a copy of which is available from the Secretariat. While parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses giving evidence today, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of their evidence at the hearing. I therefore urge witnesses to be careful about comments you may make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence. Committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. In that regard, it's important that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. If witnesses are unable to answer a question today and want more time to respond, you can take a question on notice. Written answers to questions taken on notice are to be provided within 21 days. Finally, could everyone please turn their mobile phones to silent for the duration of the hearing. I now welcome our witness. Ms Bell, as you've appeared as a witness previously in this inquiry, you are able to appear today under your former oath. However, could you please state your full name and position title for the transcript?
Sure. My name is Kylie Bell and my position title is Managing Director, Trade and Investment.
Thank you very much, Ms Bell. Would you like to start by making a short statement?
No, I've come ill prepared today in terms of making an opening statement. I think we can just get straight into your questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. On that note, we'll go straight to the opposition, Mr Daniel Mookie.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Ms Bell, for taking the time to join us. Hoping you can hear me clearly.
I can. Thank you.
And Ms Bell, I note that you were appearing either at a time where you have COVID or you're recovering from COVID. And I really do appreciate, and the committee I'm sure does appreciate you making yourself available under your present circumstances and condition as well. And we do, of course, wish you a speedy recovery.
Thank you. I'm feeling fine today.
Thank you. And can I just check that you do have in front of you the tender bundle marked Bell 002 at the bottom?
Yes, that's correct. I've just received it. Thank you.
And by any chance, were you supplied with the 2 Cartwright bundles or not as well?
I've got a tender bundle called, I think they're both, yes, I do. Tender bundle 001, Mr. Cartwright.
They're dated on 2 separate dates. There's one on the, I think, the 2nd of November and another one on the 22nd of November.
Let's hope. Let's go through and see.
Thank you,
It's quite a chunky piece of, quite a chunky set of documents, but there's definitely some Stephen Cartwright at the back.
And do you by any chance happen to have the full transcript of Mr Cartwright's evidence given to us on the 22nd of November?
Yes, that has been printed for me this morning.
Okay. Great, thank you, Ms Bell. We'll be referring to those documents throughout. Just wanted to check that you had them as well. And look, just Ms Bell, to be very clear here, the predominant purpose of us asking for your appearance today is really just to give you an opportunity to provide your account given the evidence of Mr Cartwright as well. I just want to be very clear about that. Effectively, we did want to give you a right of reply to a few of the matters that are raised. But before I do that, I might just ask you at first instance, are you in a position to provide us with an update as to where It is now the Department of Enterprise, Investment and Trade is up to in implementing the Cabinet decision to convert the stick appointments to ministerial appointments.
No, sorry, I'm not in a position to update that. I understood that that matter has been closed, but it's probably best dealt with by our General Counsel for Legal.
Okay, there's just a bit of ambiguity as to whether or not it is a continuing position of the government and or not. But you are you would be one of the people who's principally responsible for implementing it, wouldn't you? As the Managing Director of Investment and Trade.
Yes, if it. Sorry, I've got a sore throat. Yes, if it did proceed, but my understanding was that that matter was laid to rest last year. But I'm sorry, I'm not able to give an update on that.
So you're operating off the assumption that it's not proceeding any further. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Bell. That's helpful. So therefore, last time we asked at both this hearing and at the other, perhaps in estimates as well, we did ask about where the government's up to in recruiting the New York position. Are you in a position to provide us any further update on that?
Not really, no. The position is on hold pending this inquiry.
That remains unchanged?
That's correct.
Okay, but we still do have 4 people in the New York office right now?
Yes, we have 4 people in the New York office and 2 people working from our team in San Francisco.
And who is directing the New York operations in New York?
Joe, our Trade Commissioner in San Francisco,
right,
is now managing the New York team and travels down regularly to meet with them, support them.
Thank you. And just as there's a few other matters just before we get into the bulk of what we want to, I just wanted to check with you. Ms. Bell, you made the point when you appeared at the estimates hearing, when my colleague Ms. Sharp was asking you, you made the point that the general practice for you with stick commissioners is to meet with them weekly, sometimes fortnightly, things are quite busy. Is that still a continuing practice?
That is a continuing practice, yes.
And you're doing that with all the stick commissioners?
All the stick commissioners, and we have a fortnightly meeting where we also meet as a group. And in fact, the last time we met was last night.
Oh, good. And there is direct communication between you and all the stick commissioners regularly?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. And you did make the point, estimates, that you at that time, which I think was on the 1st of September 2022, were going through the process, I'm quoting for your evidence, Ms. Bell, you said you were going through the process right now of setting performance plans for the next 12 months. Each of the sticks have received their annual targets. Our offices in the UK, Europe, UK, US and Asia are very focused at the moment on attracting investment with their secondary KPIs assisting employers. Have you completed the process of setting their performance plans for the next 12 months?
Yes, our performance plans have all been set.
Great. Can you take us through what the performance plan is for the UK Agent General?
Sure. I don't have a copy handy in front of me, but in principle, we look at performance across 5 key areas. The first is delivery of customer service and KPIs. And in the case of the Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner and Agent General in the UK, that is focused, as you said, on assisting exporters and winning investment for New South Wales. Targets have been set aligned to those 2 criteria. And in the UK, we are seeking the team, not just the Agent General and the Senior Trade Commissioner, but we're seeking the team to win 10 investment projects from across the UK and Europe, to assist 50 exporters across the region, and to achieve export sales of $15 million.
Okay, and that's for a 12-month period of time?
That's correct.
Right, and you said that just previously as well, that you did describe at estimates the fact that the UK office was in the process of assisting, I think, 12 companies at the time. Can you give us any update as to how that work resolved?
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, the team are well exceeding their targets. They've assisted 175 businesses since they opened earlier this year. They've now got $2 million already in export contracts with quite a few very close to fruition. On the investment side, a number of those projects are quite high profile and therefore commercial in confidence. But last week we announced DNEG, the world's largest visual effects company from the UK, has set up an animation studio in Sydney, or will be setting up an animation studio in Sydney. And that project, for example, will create 450 new jobs. And we have a number of projects that we'll be announcing over the next few months, but we can't announce them until I guess the company has agreed that it's possible because of the nature of the commercial confidence of those projects. But absolutely, the project pipeline is looking very strong, and I'm very confident the team will achieve their goals.
Thank you, Ms Bell. Perhaps I notice if there's any further detail you wish to provide about the KPIs and the performance plans as well, for both, particularly the London position and the New York position, that would be useful.
Okay, cool.
Ms Bell, just returning to those questions my colleague was asking, these positions are ongoing. If a Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner was appointed today, how would they be appointed? Who would appoint them?
In my head, based on my understanding of where we're currently at, is that we would advertise the role externally. We would go through a formal recruitment process under public sector guidelines, and the Secretary of the Department of Enterprise, Investment and Trade would be the final delegate and make that decision. It would be a public service appointment.
And on who are they acting as the delegate for? From whom is the delegation in that description?
What do you mean, who is the delegation? So
well,
my understanding is that as these are senior appointments, is that at a sort of a band 3 level, the Secretary of our department would be the final delegate and decision maker in their appointment.
Is the final decision maker, yep. And when you describe them as the final delegate, from whom is that decision delegated in your mind?
I think through the Public Service Employment Act.
Right. And that's, further to my colleague's questions, that's your view that these would be public sector appointments by the agency, even despite that earlier decision of Cabinet?
Well, I understood look, I probably can't get into the technicality of the earlier Cabinet decision, but I understood that there had been some decision making at the end of last year, again, which I wasn't involved in, which agreed we would proceed with public service appointments, which is my understanding.
Yeah, Ms Bell, the reason I'm asking this is it's very unclear to the committee exactly how these positions are appointed, but I think it's fair to ask, if one was appointed today, how are they appointed? Is it fair to say you're slightly unclear about the Cabinet decisions and how they relate? Have you seen the Cabinet decision that endorses in your mind how this position will be appointed?
The Cabinet decision was made last year in October, as I recall, or maybe even September.
Yeah.
But I understood that at the time last year there was discussion between the Minister and Cabinet, and we agreed it would be, they would continue as public service appointments. And the last two that we ran in earlier this year certainly were conducted on that basis.
Yep. Thank you.
In terms of future, I guess we don't currently have a role that we're looking at appointing. You know, we're not currently going to market with the New York role, so it has not come up in discussions in recent times. And I guess when we're ready to do that, if we're ready to do that, we would relook at that.
Just Ms Bell, just on that though, Mr Cartwright, when he was giving us evidence, did make repeated points of that he had received an email saying that these were positions to be converted, and he's yet to receive an email to recant that view. And therefore he was certainly operating, or left the impression that he was operating on the assumption that that Cabinet submission would at some point be implemented. Is it the case that you haven't provided any update to the stick commissioners around that matter, particularly because the Japan and UK Agent General positions would have to be converted to the new arrangement?
Well, they were also recruited as also went through the same public service recruitment process as the other two positions. I'm aware of the email I think that you're referencing. I think Stephen was advised something from our secretarial CEO last year. And in my mind...
So he was actually advised?
Well, I understood from his transcript that he received an email from the CEO at the time, but I believe those documents are what I would classify as probably therefore because they relate to cabinet matters, cabinet in confidence.
Well, those documents might, but my question didn't. My question was, Mr. Cartwright has told us that he's still operating off the assumption that at some point this decision will be implemented because no one has told him anything to the contrary. Is Mr. Cartwright correct to have that view?
I can't speak to Stephen's view on that matter other than...
Have you provided any advice to the stick commissioners?
Point of order. Ms Bell was trying to provide an answer.
The simple answer is no, I personally have not provided advice. At the time last year, Stephen did not report to me and I'm not aware that any advice is needed to be provided. He was appointed as a public servant.
Well, just to be... So to allow you, Ms Bell, to fully reply to Mr Cartwright's evidence on this particular matter, Mr Cartwright has said that as a result of him working off the assumption that these were transferring into ministerial appointments, that gave him legitimacy when he sought the direct intervention of a minister in terms of his remuneration arrangements. So it's not a moot point. He made the point that he thought that was why he had the ability to contact Minister Ayres directly, and that he did so at the time in March. Is it the case that was a common understanding, to the best of your knowledge, that would be appropriate as a result?
No, look, as I understand it, matters to how the sticks that are appointed have been dealt with through the Graham Head review, and I don't really have anything further to add.
That's true, but I'm asking more about the conduct of Mr Cartwright as the stick commissioner, because when he made the relatively, as I described it, extraordinary decision to seek the direct intervention of a minister, he justified it by saying that he was told that these were converting to ministerial positions and he was never told anything to the contrary. So, as the person who was his direct supervisor at the time, and we'll get into these matters a bit more later, I'm just asking you as to whether or not at any point, particularly prior to March, you certainly gave Mr Cartwright advice that would say the government wasn't proceeding with that transition any further.
All I can say is that Stephen, to my knowledge, is very aware that he reports to the department. He does not report to a minister. He reports into myself and the department as per our organisational structure and as per his performance plans.
And Ms Bell, just to return to this question about the appointments, I appreciate you've given us your clearest understanding of, in your mind, how these positions are appointed, which is really appreciated. The committee's got to make a clear finding on this matter about how these appointments are now made.
Crucial.
I'm interested in your view. Have you been given clear direction as to how these appointments are made? As of today, if you did have to appoint someone, do you feel you've been given clear direction about how that appointment would unfold?
Yes, I feel our clear direction is that these are public sector roles and these are senior public servant roles and that they would be advertised on a competitive basis and appointed through a public sector process.
And that's been conveyed to you in a formal manner?
No, I guess not. No, this is the discussions that we have undertaken as a department over the last, I guess it's nearly 12 months that we've been running these processes. And I have not been flagged that we would change the process.
How can you, if it hasn't been conveyed to you in a formal manner, as the Managing Director of Trade and Investment, how can you be certain that that's how these roles are to be appointed?
I can only be certain on the basis that we literally have, through the review of the Graham Head review, I believe there was findings in that process through Premier's media statement that these roles were public service roles and will be public service roles. I mean, I'd have to check some of those, some of the correspondence and so on. But it's my belief that these are public sector roles and that we would be running transparent recruitment processes for them.
And you, in order to form that view, which I accept is your understanding, so I think that's actually quite helpful for us, you've relied on the public statements by the Premier in response to the head review. That's the clearest direction, the most formal
I think that's the clearest direction. And look, it's all hypothetical because obviously we have not advertised a role, so we've not had to necessarily have those discussions. Positions are currently filled, and they were all filled through a public sector process.
And just finally, I'll ask: have you been given clear direction on that question about if or when these roles might change? Is that ruled out now from your point of view? That is, could they convert to ministerial appointments down the track? Have you been given a clear answer on that? Has that been formally conveyed to you, or has it not been conveyed to you?
I feel like the word conveyed is too strong. We've not discussed it because these positions are all, as far as I think the department is concerned, are senior public service roles. There's not been a debate or a discussion around converting them to ministerial appointments, no.
All right, thank you.
Ms Bell, there's just one other what I would describe as a residual matter, which I think we have to put to you and sort of get your evidence on, if you don't mind. It just arises from some evidence, some documents that have been produced to us since your last appearance. I just want to be upfront about the fact that it is to do with the New York position and the events of October last year. And I just thought perhaps now's the time to ask, before we get into the more detail around sort of the response evidence you may have to Mr Cartwright's views as well. But can I ask, just in respect to, you're quite right in saying that the government made a decision last year to convert these two ministerial positions. And I think it's been confirmed to us that took place around the 17th of September, that conversion took place. And of course, we've gone through at some length the response of the department to that at the time as well. But can I ask, do you have any specific recall of either discussing with Ms Brown or Minister Ayres a scenario in which Minister Ayres would agree to endorse the three already chosen candidates for New York, Mumbai and Singapore?
Well, I don't recall. I'm looking at an email here, so that helps me recall. I think at the time, so first up, I was asked to act in Jenny's role when she went on leave in October last year, so I hadn't been privy to a lot of the conversations that had been held previously. But I think after the decision had been made by government in late September, a number of us had a short meeting to determine next steps and whether, because we had already gone through, as I mentioned, a public service recruitment process for a number of the roles. Now, I wasn't involved in that process, but the ask was to consider how we might proceed given that things had changed. And we did, as I understand it, have candidates that were perhaps ready or nearly ready to go through that process. So there was a discussion as to whether we should put forward those candidates to the Minister for consideration or what we should do. But at the time, I don't believe any meeting was held and I don't believe action was taken for at least another month or two.
Okay, well, we might just unpack that a little.
Internal discussion around, okay, what do we do next?
Yeah, thank you, Ms Bell. We might just unpack that just a little. At the time of around 6 October last year, the three candidates who had been identified for those roles in New York, the candidate who had been identified that may be capable of endorsement was Miss West, correct?
I didn't know that at the time. I just knew that there was three candidates. Yep. But now, I guess now that this is, now that we've seen a lot of documents and media reporting on the matter, I'm aware, yes, that it was Miss West. And with
for the Mumbai position, it was the current person who is serving in the role?
I can't be sure because I wasn't given the details of the candidates, but my understanding is that the candidates for India and the Middle East and Singapore and ASEAN that were selected at the time are the ones that are now currently in the role, yes.
Okay, and just to be clear here, in respect to Miss West, we have had evidence that Miss West was told around the 27th of September that she couldn't proceed, or actually earlier than that, as a result of the Cabinet decision. But still, when you became acting in the role, you thought, or at least there was a discussion in which Miss West, the option of Miss West was at least canvassed as an option to continue with her candidacy?
To protect the, I think, privacy of Miss West, I was not briefed on any of that development. I understood that she was on medical leave, so at the time I was not aware that any of these conversations had sort of taken place, and I was not briefed, I guess, out of respect for whatever was going on privately.
Okay. But then there was some form of a collective discussion, and perhaps it was agreed that there might be scope if Minister Ayres was prepared to endorse those three candidates, that you could proceed, or the Investment New South Wales at the time could proceed with the appointment.
I'm sorry, you just broke out.
So, but I think you said earlier there was a discussion in which it was that resolved in favour of perhaps presenting Minister Ayres with the option of proceeding with the three already chosen candidates. That's correct?
Yes, so my understanding, which I guess was only a half understanding based on what I know now, is that if we had three suitable candidates that were considered through a public sector process to be suitable, that we could present them to the Minister.
Okay, can you mind turning to page 4 of the tender that's been presented to you today?
Sure, 1 second. Yep, I have it open.
This might be the email that you were making a reference to. Before, you can see that this is a email that you sent to Miss Brown and others in Investment New South Wales, correct?
That's correct.
And if you just go down, you see that you say, "Hi everyone, Mr. Carr and I had a chat about last week's Cabinet decisions re stick appointments." And then you go on to say, "We agreed there may be scope if Minister Ayres had already endorsed our three candidates to move forward the stick candidates we had for New York, Mumbai and Singapore." And so just be very pausing there. You're making reference to the fact that Minister Ayres had signed briefing notes agreeing to New York, Mumbai and Singapore candidates. In an advisory release, he was notified that they were the people who were chosen.
I think it says if Minister Ayres, I think it was a question as opposed to a statement, even though I don't have a question mark at the end.
Well, yes, that's
Minister
fair.
Ayres,
You assumed, if you were making an assumption, had the assumption been valid?
I wasn't sure whether he had or not, to be honest, and I couldn't tell you if at that point he'd seen any briefing documents to suggest those candidates. It was more a question.
Well,
I guess as I
it was an
read this,
assumption,
it was me.
Miss Bell. Sorry, it was more of an assumption that he had, correct? Not so much a question, because the other people in this conversation well and truly knew what Mr. Ayres had.
But I guess for me it was assumption is a fair word, but more of a question. And I was trying to push through. Selfishly, I think that we don't hold back the appointments for another 6 months because we were very keen to deliver the network. So I guess it was an email of brainstorming what could be done in order to move forward. But yes, of course, I had not seen any briefs. I don't know if Minister Ayres ever did either for those three roles.
Fair enough. But as we've since learnt, your assumption was valid. He had agreed to it by this point in time. But then you go on to say, and you could describe, we would still need to get his confirmation that these three appointments he would like to make based on the experience and the process we've already gone through. Now, we have had evidence from Miss Brown that she did provide this as an option. Were you present at that meeting with Mr. Ayres?
No, I don't believe my first meetings with Minister Ayres started till either later in the year or even in January this year.
Well, it happens to be the case that certainly the evidence that Miss Brown gives us correlates pretty tightly with his timeline. which is that around that week she did provide him with the option, if he so decided, to continue on with those appointments, which he does do in effect for Mumbai and Singapore, but not New York. Do you recall having discussions with Ms Brown about any instructions she gave you following any discussions with the Minister?
Yeah, so I don't recall having any conversations with her, probably for at least, my gut feel is November. I received probably a call, but maybe an email from her that we should go ahead with the 2 candidates that were identified for Mumbai and Singapore. And I believe she might have, over the course of early November at some point, provided an introduction to me to those 2 candidates, as well as probably our people and culture and legal team. So we could begin discussions with them around contract negotiations, and, you know, talk to them about the role. I was not present with the meeting with Minister Ayres where she discussed that. I'm pretty clear on that because I remember it was a conversation that we had, I think over email, not in a meeting that I was at. In regards to the New York role, I don't know that I got any clear direction on that, other than later in the year we went back to market. But
Yeah.
that's, you know, that's my recollection of kind of what happened sometime around November. It certainly wasn't in October, because I believe the 2 final candidates were only announced in December. But typically we would have started those conversations with the 2 candidates in November.
I think that accords with the documents that we have in respect to those 2 positions as well. But you can see on this email on page 4, you go on to say, we'd have to work through this as an option. If Ayres was willing to proceed on this basis, we could group next week and develop a path to make this work. Did that ever happen?
No, I think we were asked because at that point things were pretty chaotic. There'd been a change obviously in government, and I believe even the Secretary of DPC departed, and I do believe it took us a month to regroup with changes in ministerial responsibilities. I think around about the 6th, maybe the Deputy Premier had just resigned as well as the Minister for Trade. And so there was a period of uncertainty in that October, to my recollection.
But you also, just above that, you do make the point that, as you rightly said to us, your concern was to make sure that the international network did not get held up any further. But you go on to say, we could keep going and deliver him some quick wins, which he will be after as well. So, I mean, this was basically you anticipating the fact that the Minister probably would have wanted to sort of have some action here as opposed to more process. Is that fair?
That's fair. And so I think it took us a few weeks. I guess in the scheme of things, as you can see, this process has been drawn out over 3 years, but a few weeks in October, it was probably not the end of the world, but I feel like it was early November where we started to get agreement that we would proceed on appointments.
But just so I'm clear, you certainly collectively with the senior leaders of Investment New South Wales, and to be frank, you're corresponding here with the most senior leaders of Investment New South Wales at the time. You've had a meeting in which you've canvassed the presentation of the options of continuing on with the existing appointments. You've then obviously written to the senior leaders with whom you had that discussion with a view that such an option should be presented to the Minister.
I don't think, I think it's actually, to be honest, it was probably, as you can see, I think in my first line, it's actually just Chris Carr and I had a sort of a bit of a brainstorm.
Sorry, you're correct, Ms Bell, but you then informed the other senior leaders.
That's correct. And I think Chris had used the conversation because at that point I hadn't been aware and I was just ploughing on as I do. With my understanding of what occurred, I believe Chris might have used that opportunity just to give me an update as well that things had changed and that something had gone to Cabinet that I was not aware of. And so this email was kind of my brain dump around what we might be able to do to keep going.
Well, the email was a documentation of perhaps the brain dump you had with Mr Carr. Is probably the Might be just more the strict interpretation, Ms. Bell, but nevertheless, you have the conversation with Mr. Carr, you inform the senior leaders that this option is present. It does seem as though Ms. Brown presents the option to the Minister. The advice is taken in respect to the Mumbai and Singapore positions, but not the New York position, and you're not given any explanation as to why there was a distinction between New York and the other two. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Thank you. And then effectively you go on to appoint the Mumbai and Singapore positions and reopen the New York position thereafter, after that decision is made effectively by the CEO or people above you in the hierarchy. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe the CEO signed off on the appointments probably in November, December. Once agreements and contracts were finalised, I believe the positions were announced.
Just finally, prior to my passing to my colleague on this particular matter, as you were attending the weekly meetings or the fortnightly meetings or the regular meetings between Minister Ayres and the senior leadership of Investment New South Wales, which I think from your previous evidence you'd made the point was you were either present at some of those discussions or sporadically present at those discussions?
That's correct. So I don't believe, and again, my recollection is the meetings certainly between the Minister and his people and with the CEO were held weekly. The rest of us, the leadership team, were invited in depending on the agenda.
As needed.
And so they weren't necessarily weekly.
Yeah.
I don't recall having many meetings with Minister Ayres on a regular basis until 2021 or 2022, sorry, until this year. I think last year my involvement was much more sporadic.
Okay, but just no sporadic meetings, you don't recall any specific discussions around the appointment process for New York that you haven't already described to us?
No.
And you've given evidence just then that there was no clear direction given to you as the distinction between these two roles and what happened with the New York role. Can I just ask though, was there any speculation or any discussion? It's, was a clear distinction. Was there any discussion around why New York was being dealt with differently?
In my head, it was not discussed, but I feel that I probably was aware that Jenny may have been a candidate, not because I had ever been told, but because it was obvious that something was going on. And at that point she was on leave, so I didn't push the question. I didn't push it, no.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you. We might just, unless there's anything further you want to add, Ms. Bell, to that, we may move on.
Sure, it's fine.
Thank you.
I don't have anything further to add.
Could I, just so, Ms. Bell, I know we've asked you this before, but I might just ask you again. Do you mind just setting out, just in chronological terms, the responsibilities you held in this process at various points in time? So we understand that when you were with Treasury, you were partially involved, correct, in the establishment of the Global New South Wales Strategy?
That's correct. So I guess when I first joined the New South Wales Government, it was actually with the Department of Industry. So at that point in time, I was the Executive Director for Trade and Investment. So over the last 4 years, I guess I've been doing a very similar role, but for a number of different departments and agencies. And every year I move to a new department, but the role is largely the same, working with exporters to help them succeed overseas and working with investors to help them grow in New South Wales.
And look, Ms. Bell, I can't but help feel that we should acknowledge your patience as administrative arrangements seem to have changed around you constantly as well. So
yeah,
we might join this. Sorry, Ms. Bell.
Oh no, certainly the role in New South Wales Treasury, I was the Executive Director for Trade and International there. And so I moved across with my role and the team at the machinery of government changes when Investment New South Wales was first created in March last year.
Sure. So, yes. Okay, so just to keep up, we find ourselves in a position where you're with Treasury until effectively, from some we don't need to establish precisely when you join Treasury, but you are with Treasury at the time where Treasury is developing the strategy, and you transfer over to Investment New South Wales when Investment New South Wales is formed around April 2021?
That's correct.
And there you're fulfilling a role same to what you are now under reporting to Ms West?
Well, I think my role was different then. I was the Executive Director for Trade, so I managed a team onshore.
Sure.
There's a group that looks after export, international education, skilled migration, a number of other teams. And then in October last year, and I was also responsible from a day-to-day basis for the program management of the rollout of the international network.
So just before we get to the events to the October transfer, just in respect to the role that you occupied between April and October, were you involved in the recruitment, selection and negotiations with the stick commissioners, particularly Japan and New York and UK?
No, those positions clearly reported to Ms West.
Yeah.
And she was the responsible line manager for the recruitment.
Okay.
And of course the CEO. So because of the seniority of the roles, the delegate for appointment was actually the CEO.
Fair enough. And then in October, you act in Miss West's place as she's placed on leave, or she goes on leave.
That's correct.
And therefore, that's at that point in time, you take responsibility for the direct supervision of the UK position and the Japan position, because those positions had been appointed.
Yeah, and they were reporting to Jenny at the time. That's correct.
And then at that point, though, the UK Agent General was still onshore, as in Australia.
That's correct.
And was the Japan Commissioner in Japan?
No, he too was onshore.
Sure.
So COVID, borders were closed, and both here in Australia and in Japan, and we weren't able to apply for visas.
And then equally, from what point do you cease to act in the role and become I presume?
So in November I stopped acting in the role, and I was the Executive Director for Trade and International and reported directly to Amy, the CEO, Ms Brown, following, I think Ms West departed sometime in November, December. And then in February this year, 2022, the structure had two roles, a Deputy Secretary for Investment and a Deputy Secretary, the old Deputy Secretary for Trade role. The CEO merged my Executive Director Trade and International role with the Managing Director Investment role to create a role that was responsible for trade and investment, which essentially tried to bring the two teams onshore, one team that focused on export and taking things from New South Wales to the world, and then the team that facilitated investment from the offshore network, as well as the international network, to bring it together into one functioning team. Because the overseas offices, I think it's been very well publicised, one of their key objectives is to attract investment from around the world into New South Wales. It made sense that the Deputy Secretary for Investment role was brought together with the trade team to try and deliver solutions across the entire network. So that decision, I guess I would call it a restructure, was made in February.
Okay. So can I do appreciate that, Ms Bell, that the complicated description of the change of responsibility. But so it's actually quite important, and we're going to have to, forgive me as we get very technical now, but we are actually going to have to explore certain matters arising between what authorities you had in October versus what authorities you had in February, if you don't mind. But just so I'm clear, let's concentrate on the period in October. In October, when you become acting for responsibility, you are responsible for the direct management of the two stick positions, correct? That were at that point appointed, Japan and UK?
Yes, I believe I was asked to act. It was actually on a week-by-week basis. I wasn't aware what was going on, so I understood that it was just for a couple of weeks to cover sick leave.
Sure. And that was from October to November, correct?
Yeah, and it ended up being October to November, that's correct.
And then when you are appointed to the role in November, you effectively assume the same duties you had October, but albeit this time on a permanent basis, to the best of your knowledge.
You might just have to explain that to me, I'm a bit foggy, but essentially I was acting as a band 3 for a few months, and then I went back to a band 2 and continued to do the role from that period onward as a band 2.
Okay, so the responsibilities were transferred from a band 3 to band 2, but you still
Correct.
effectively had the same responsibilities.
That's correct. So even, I guess, after I stopped acting in the band 3 role, the position, a decision was made that the sticks would continue to report to me, which was why at that point in time I continued to take forward recruitment and negotiations with the candidates in December.
Okay, so I'm going to separate out the candidates with whom you were recruiting and negotiating and instead concentrate on the 2 positions that you were supervising, and in particular one, which is the UK Agent General. Can I just establish, you were responsible for their developing their work plan and day-to-day management, so to speak?
That's correct.
And then equally in handling any issues to do with their onboarding, correct?
That's correct.
And equally any issues that they may or may not have had with their contract at the time, correct?
Well, actually, in the case of Stephen, he'd been on, well, so sorry, the 2 senior trade commissioners that we had at the time commenced in July. So I think, in fairness, a lot of their onboarding would have been June, July, August. You know, it doesn't take 6 months to be onboarded.
But there's there comes a point in law where under his contract in which the onboarding ceases and therefore certain
I
allowances.
think it's a 3-month probation period, but so actually technically the probation period.
Just to be very specific here, Ms Bell, I think as the evidence we've heard is that the ability for Mr Cartwright to access his cost of living allowances turned on when technically his onboarding period ended, and for which Investment New South Wales maintained at the time that was when he was in London, and he had a view that no, it was payable at the point where his onboarding had effectively ceased. So not much turns on it, to be frank, in terms of where I'm heading with Bell, but I take your point as well. But you were at least, you accept that you were responsible for dealing with Mr Cartwright at first instance should he have any issues or concerns with the application of his contract?
Nothing turns on it, but let's talk a little bit.
Sorry, does the Deputy President wish to say anything? Are you?
Oh, no,
Order.
it's fascinating.
Order.
Just because
Mr.
we're doing this
Mr.
online,
Mookie,
so
order.
I just don't want to be rude to the
If we can just continue
Deputy
with our
President.
questions and not address each other over the table.
You've been
but
very
yes,
well
Mr.
behaved
Fang,
so
he has been. If you have any interjections,
Gold star
Mr.
for
Fang, or
Wales.
anything to say, please do it through the chair via a point of order. Mr. Mookie, if you can continue your questions.
So you were responsible for handling any issues that may arise from the application of his contract in that period of time, correct?
Well, I was his line manager. Whether my line manager is responsible for my contract or that's a matter for people and culture and some of our other departments. Certainly I was his line manager and responsible for his performance and his day-to-day work.
Did you have the...
Typically, if I had an issue with, I don't know, my leave or my pay, I probably would not take it up with my manager. I would probably be consulting, I guess, with our operations group on some of those matters, to be honest, as a public servant.
Just to be clear, Ms Bell, did you have the authority at that point to agree to variations to Mr Cartwright's contract?
No.
Okay. And can I ask you then, in respect to the arrangements that applied in February, did you have the authority at that point to agree to variations in his contract?
No.
Okay, and who did?
So because they are senior public servant appointments, they are a director or above or equivalent. The relevant authority or delegate at that point in time was the CEO of Investment New South Wales, and that delegation later passed to the Secretary
Yes.
of the Department of Enterprise and Trade and Investment.
But do you agree that you effectively played some role in February?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Can you describe
Well,
what
not
role
in
you played?
February. I feel like that might be way too soon. But certainly...
Do you want to describe what role you played in the issues that arose in October and what role you played in the issues that arose in February?
October, I played no role. I don't know that I was even privy to any conversations. Certainly, Mr. Cartwright had not raised it with me. any concerns that he had, and did not flag them with me. I believe any concerns he had around his contract, he went back to the people he negotiated his contract with. In February and March this year, Stephen, Mr. Cartwright, had requested, and look, my understanding is he reached out to the Minister in March, February or March, requesting us to relook at the structuring of his agreement.
Do you recall whether he did that in February, or do you recall whether he did that in March?
I don't know, because I don't think it was in an email. I believe it was in a text message that he reached out to the Minister. So I'm not clear on dates for that. Certainly, Mr. Cartwright had raised with me, probably before he raised with the Minister, his interest in having his package relooked at in line with the packages offered by the Commonwealth and other state governments. And I'm certainly aware that I discussed this with the CEO as the appropriate delegate, but I can't be sure, to be honest, if it was February or March. Mr. Cartwright only arrived in London, I think, on the 31st of January. So I would imagine it was in his first couple of months that the conversation started to be held, once he became aware of how others within Australia House, how their packages were developed.
So, Ms. Bell, I will have to just step that out a bit and B, press you for some better recollection if possible. So you said that he raised it with you. Is it your recollection that he raised it with you soon at the point that he arrived in London?
In my recollection, it certainly wouldn't have been in the first 2 weeks. No. So I guess just because of the timeline of his arrival, my feeling would be, and look, I don't have access to emails or documents, but my sense is it would have been in late February, March.
You don't recollect him raising it with you?
Just because of the timeline, he would have only landed, and literally his first week in the office would have been the first week of February.
So your recollection is that he was there for a month, not before, and then you say that you then raised it with the CEO. Do you recall when you did that and how you did that?
It probably would have just been a phone conversation. I don't recall that I sent any formal emails. I think at that point in time we were back in the office, and so we were meeting face to face and having more regular interaction than we'd sort of had over the year before, where everything was done over email during COVID. My gut feel is, again, it was sort of, my gut feel is about March.
Okay, and then do you recollect what the CEO told you what to do when you raised Mr. Cartwright's desire to modify his package?
Look, so I think what we wanted to do was develop it on a fact base, and so the CEO had asked me to put doing some benchmarking clearly around what other state governments and what the Commonwealth do in terms of how they package their overseas remuneration for their either senior trade commissioners for Austrade or for the other state governments. And so at that point, I recall that my first point was to start looking at annual reports for both Austrade and DFAT publish how they package their senior executive staff compensation, and I started to do that. So I feel like it was in March.
Okay.
And based on the findings of that benchmarking work, certainly, I mean, I've got copies of Austrade's and DFAT's annual reports. The way Austrade and DFAT and actually other state governments package their, and I can't say the word remuneration, but they, the way they package is they include a base salary, a cost of living allowance, and they're very clear that they do provide other benefits, including, and I mean, I've got a copy of the annual report here, basically Austrade has public service employees working in overseas location who are paid allowances and benefits related to overseas postings. Allowances and benefits include residential rent for overseas accommodation, cost of living allowances, allowances and education expenses for children living abroad, car parking, motor vehicle, car hire, leave fares, medical costs and insurance, study assistance and home assistance. And so through the work that I did looking at pretty publicly available information, particularly around how the Commonwealth and other governments do this, it became apparent that providing just a lump sum payment probably was not the way others did it, and it may not be best practice.
Just to be fair, Ms Bell, I'm not going to go too much down the page, but it is the case, is it not, that the Austrade stick positions that are paid there have a base salary which is substantially lower than the one we were paying the Agent General, correct?
Yes, that's correct. But
So it's the case that the...
Point of order.
It shows on
Ms.
page
Bell's
135 of their annual
I don't think
report
she's
that
hearing you,
6 of
Principal.
their staff have earned packages in total value of more than 600,000.
True.
And in fact,
But-
most of them, 4 of them have benefits and allowances of over $500,000 in value.
But true, and
So
I
it's standard and not
don't
taxed.
dispute that, Ms Bell.
And I
Chair, can I
understand
just
that-
take point of order? at this point?
Okay, order. Ms Bell, Mr Fang's taken a point of order. I'm not sure you can
Oh,
hear him
sorry.
very well. That's okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to take the point of order that every time you seek to provide a detailed response as opposed to a cursory response, and it seems to be, Chair, that the detailed response is not to the liking of members opposite, they seek to cut Ms Bell off or ask her a subsequent question.
Thank you,
She
Mr.
needs to be provided, given the WebEx and given the issues with the communication, she needs to be provided the ability to provide a complete answer, as she just did, which contradicted the position that Mr Mookie had put to her. So I suspect that was why he knew that was coming. I suspect that's why he sought to cut her off. She needs to be provided the opportunity to complete her response before the
Thank
next
you,
question
Mr
is
Fang.
put.
Thank you, Mr Fang. There is no point of order. I think everybody was coping fine. But I will remind Mr
Thank you.
Mookie to, just particularly for Hansard's purposes, let's try not to
Sure.
talk over the
I
witness
actually-
and allow the witness to complete her answer.
I appreciate that, Chair. I actually think the question that I was asking the witness was more whether or not at that point what instructions she was given by Ms Brown before Ms Bell was then describing the benchmarking exercise in some detail. So I might ask Ms Bell to return to the first question that was asked, which was...
Sorry, I got off track.
Just-
Mr Fang, that's not helpful.
The question that I was asking was, as we were working through the chain of events that Ms Bell was describing, was that she was in conversation with the CEO, and I think she said that to her best recollection, was taking place in March, about what instructions the CEO gave us. And I appreciate Ms Bell then describing how she acted on the instructions of the CEO in quite some detail, but the actual question was, Ms Bell, do you recall when precisely the CEO was giving you instructions?
No,
Mr Fang.
No.
Mr Fang.
No, yeah, I can have a point of order.
Well, I just know it's not going to be a point of order.
It is a point of order. That's not the question.
Just
that
saying
I'm
point of
taking-
order
that
doesn't
I was
make
taking the point of order on.
What is your point of order, Mr
The
Fang?
point of order was the question that was put to Ms Bell by Mr Mookie was...
No, that's not a point of order. You can't
No,
take
no,
a
no.
point of order in terms of what a member asks a question about. They're entitled to ask questions. Mr Mookie is going
Mr.
back to
Mookie
Ms Bell,
editorialised around
clarifying
the
the
question
question
that
he is asking
that was
her.
not the point of order that I took the question on.
Can I just...
The point of order that I took the question on was around the Austrade positions having a lower pay base, and then Ms Bell was...
Mr Fang, it's
was
not up to
actually
you
correcting
to work
that,
out
which is
what...
when
Mr Fang,
Mookie-
that's not a point of order. That is not a point of order. That's not a point of order. It's not a point of order. No, I allow points of order if they are valid, and I have
It is
done
a
so
valid point
in the
of
past.
order.
Where's the standing order
You
that
are
says
kind of
that's a
running
valid
into
point of order?
interference. So we'll go back to Mr Mookie. This also isn't helpful for Ms Bell, who is trying to concentrate on what the question asked is. So Mr Mookie will go back, and hopefully we can get back to Ms Bell and Mr Mookie.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Bell, I think I was asking you when do you recollect Ms Brown giving you the instructions, and I think you had established that it was in March and April, or around that time. Did I hear you correctly in that respect?
That's correct. Maybe Yeah,
And
I
then-
feel like March, April.
Thank you. And Ms Bell, after undertaking the benchmarking exercise that you just described, you did provide a formal brief to the CEO for her endorsement around a contract variation, did you not?
That's correct. I
And then
think
that-
that occurred in June, early June,
And then that variation was executed in June,
late June,
to your best of your recollection.
to the best of my recollection, yes.
I'm-
I'm certain it was executed in June because we wanted the new arrangements to commence in July for the new financial year.
Thank you. Ms Bell, I'm going to ask you just to really test your memory around the events of February, especially here. Do you recall immediately upon Mr Cartwright coming to London, him raising with you concerns to do with the application of his package?
To be honest, no. I remember him being excited to be in London finally. But that's not to say that it didn't occur, no.
Do you
My
recall-
recollection is it probably took a few weeks, or at least a month.
That's absolutely your recollection.
Yes.
Thank
but
you, Ms Bell. Can I ask as well, at the time of February, your recollection, which accords with the timeline we have, is that Mr Cartwright became in country around 31 January, correct?
That's correct.
And it's
So
your
I-
recollection, is it not, Ms Bell, that Ms Brown and Minister Ayres were heading to the UK for a trip around the 7th of February, correct?
Yes, I believe they travelled actually for a cabinet and confidence project. Yes, that's correct.
Do you recall Mr Cartwright complaining to you that Destination New South Wales were dominating that trip in terms of its organisation, and that Minister Ayres wasn't finding the time to see him or to participate in launching the office? Do you recall him raising?
Yes, I do recall that.
Do you recall also having conversations with Miss Brown by any chance whilst she was in London or thereafter, in which she raised with you concerns to do with the accommodation package and the rent position of Mr Cartwright, sorry?
So the visit of Miss Brown and the Minister to London was actually for tourism purposes, and it was related to a commercial project that they were working on, which is why Stephen's involvement in the program was limited. Destination New South Wales also have an office in London, and I believe their team was responsible for developing out that program. And that's all I'll say on that matter. I don't know whether Minister Ayres met with Stephen or...
Well, Mr Cartwright's evidence is he did not, and in Minister Ayres' trip report... Sorry, Ms Bell.
Sorry. I understood that certainly Mr Cartwright picked them up from the airport and was able to meet with them on the first day, but I believe the reason for their visit was a matter unrelated to trade and investment, which was why they may not have met with Mr Cartwright, because the Minister's portfolio goes beyond trade and investment. Secondly, following that visit, I don't recall Miss Brown discussing with me his package, but she may have, like, if it was discussed, it was, I guess, not top of my mind at that point.
Okay. Can I just put to you very clearly, do you recall sending an email to Mr Cartwright in which you say, good news, I had a quick debrief with Amy on a few things this morning and she's comfortable with amending your package to pay your accommodation directly on or about the middle of February this year?
I don't remember doing it, but if that's what the date is, then that's obviously I did do it.
No, I'm saying, do you recall an email? Do you recall an
Sorry?
email in February in which you say, good news, I had a quick debrief with Amy on a few things this morning and she's comfortable with us amending your package to pay the accommodation directly?
Then we must have been having the conversation in February. Yeah.
No, Ms Bell, I'm not asking you to comment on whether or not, I'm asking you, do you recall? Do you have recollection of sending such an email and having such a conversation?
I do recall having conversations and sending an email, but whether I recall whether it was in February or March, I'm unclear.
I'm going to take you to page 5 of the transcript of Mr. Cartwright's evidence, if you don't mind, that was given to us on the 22nd of November 2022.
All right. Can you help me just direct me to
Page 5.
of Mr. Cartwright bundle 001?
No, it's the transcript, the Hansard transcript.
Okay, got that.
Yep.
Thank you. Just 1 second. I mean, perhaps you can just start reading me through what you're going to say while I find it.
I think I
Yep,
perhaps have to
that's
wait for you to
fine.
find it
Yeah.
and take you to page 5.
That's correct. I have it.
Great. Do you mind turning to page 5?
I have, yes.
Great. You can just see if you can go down, just so you can see that I ask a question where you go, I say you agree that within 2 weeks you were pretty determined to raise it with Miss Brown upon her visit to London, 2 weeks that is of your arrivals. You see that when I ask that question, which is about the 3rd paragraph down?
Yes, I can see.
Mr. Cartwright replies by going, 2 weeks after my arrival, yes. I wanted to have a preliminary conversation with her, so by the time the temporary accommodation expired, I was in a position to know what I was doing. I then go on to read from actually Mr. Cartwright's opening statement, in which he says that he received an email from you, which you say, good news, I had a quick debrief with Amy on a few things this morning and she's comfortable with us amending your package to pay the accommodation directly. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And just to be clear and to be fair to Mr. Cartwright, he says he received this email from you on the 14th of February 2022, which is much earlier than your recollection of only commencing this process in March.
Yes.
Do you recall?
So that would have been just, if I'm correct in the timeline, this would be directly when Miss Brown returned from the UK?
It seems that way. Or, actually, to be frank, it could also have been a conversation that you may have had with Miss Brown while she was in the UK.
I don't recall that I spoke to Miss Brown while she was in the UK.
So nevertheless, on the 14th of February, because to be frank, look, checking the trip details, and I'm sure someone will check the trip report, I'm not confident that Miss Brown is back in Australia on the 14th of February, but Mr. Cartwright is adamant that apparently Miss Brown and or you agreed to amend the package well before you undertook the benchmarking exercise you just described. And it seems therefore, Ms. Bell, that on the basis of what you told us this morning, is that that benchmarking exercise which you took place in March and or April took place to retrospectively justify a decision to amend Mr. Cartwright's package. And so it's not like, on the basis of the timeline that's been presented to us, it looks as though within 2 weeks of Mr. Cartwright arriving, through some alchemy, Miss Brown comes to agree to amend the package, which may or may not have involved discussions with you, and then you embark upon a benchmarking exercise to justify the decision. So I'm going to ask you to again give us your best recollection of the events of February that led to the decision to adjust Mr. Cartwright's rent package and incur a greater expense for taxpayers and deliver him a tax saving.
I might just go back. So first up, technically the cost to the taxpayer is quite similar. But my honest recollection, and I'm looking at my notes from that period, is that we started to do the benchmarking exercise in March. I really can't speak to whether we had conversations. I mean, part of the benchmarking exercise, I mean, it's no secret that you know that I used to work for Austrade and was a commissioner, and so therefore I'm very aware how the packages are built for an expatriate or for someone on a posting. Certainly CEO and I may have had conversations earlier than March around how my package when I worked for Austrade was structured and whether that is the right way to go, and whether that delivers better value for both the person in the role. But honestly, in my, hard to recall now because a lot of these were phone conversations and personal conversations. But I do believe it was certainly late February, March.
But Ms Bell, I don't doubt, and nor do I dispute the professionalism upon which you undertook the technical benchmark exercise in March or April. The point that I'm putting to you is that you did that after the decision was already made, and it was done retrospectively to justify that decision as well. Do you wish to reply to that?
Simply then, in my view, that's not true, no.
So, Mr Cartwright, if you go back to page 5 of the transcript, you can see that I just read to you the interchange I had with Mr Cartwright. And you can see down the page, he goes, yes, well, Miss Brown had only just got back from her trip to London, so that given that I hadn't had the opportunity to raise it with her, I was very grateful that Miss Bell raised it with her. When I got that advice, you can see that Miss Bell went on to say, if you wanted to go after that apartment today, then go for it. So to me, what I had there was an approval to proceed on the basis that the government would pay the rent. So I was very pleased about it. So again, I'm going to ask you, Miss Bell, to test your recollection and see whether or not you do recall.
I don't recall that Stephen entered into an agreement on the apartment until...
Sorry, Miss Bell, if you don't mind, let me just finishing the question. Do you recall raising with Miss Brown concerns to do with Mr Cartwright's rent and accommodation prior to her departure to London or during her trip to London?
Well, the simple answer is no, I don't recall.
Is it possible that you did?
I don't recall that the focus of her visit or my discussions with her prior to the visit were around Stephen's or Mr Cartwright's accommodation.
So is it possible that you did raise it with her and you just don't recall it?
Prior to her travel?
Or during her
I don't
travel?
think so. No, I'm quite certain that we didn't speak while she was away. So
Okay.
it would have only been upon her return. And I really, in terms of the priorities that we had at the time, I don't recall raising it with her before she departed. I think her visit to the UK was quite rushed and she only had a few days' notice. And absolutely the focus of the visit was just trying to get it into country when borders had just opened up.
Do you recall at the time Mr Cartwright raising with you the concern that he had discovered upon his arrival in London to do with the rent and accommodation?
Yeah, I certainly do, but I felt like it had taken longer upon his arrival for him to raise the concern. I don't recall he raised it within his first week or two.
So can I just take you...
He may have in retrospect, but at the time I felt like we had at least a month before, maybe we didn't, but I felt like we had at least a month with him being in country before it was raised.
So then...
Again, it's just my recollection of dates and how things went at that time of the year.
I appreciate that, Ms Bell, but you can go down and you can see here, again, we're now towards the bottom of the page, and I ask Mr Cartwright, were you having a dialogue with Ms Bell whilst Mr Brown and Minister Rose were in London about this? To which Mr Cartwright said, I had raised it with Ms Bell around the same time. I don't know whether during that 6-day period I have conversations with Ms Bell, I may or may not have, but I was certainly having some conversations with Ms Bell during this period on the issue. Does that prompt any better recollection?
Look, like I said, it's 2 weeks here or there. Stephen certainly did raise with me at some point his accommodation and the prospect of repackaging his agreement, whether it was in early February or March. I'm really not clear. But certainly he did raise it, absolutely, which was why adjustments were made.
Yes, no doubt he raised it, but just to be very clear here, I'm asking you specifically about whether or not you have recall of having these conversations in the first 2 weeks of February.
I honestly don't have recall, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Thank you, Ms Bell.
It is actually just a general, I don't recall.
Fair enough. Mr Cartwright then goes on, and it becomes relevant because when I start to explore why, therefore, Mr Cartwright was needing to contact Minister Ayres in March if the issue was in fact resolved on February 14th to his satisfaction, why he then sought the intervention of the minister. He says that he said to you, in fact I'm quoting now from the final paragraph on page 5, I said to Miss Bell, I think we had a phone call that if I'm going to make a commitment to a long-term lease, then I would really be grateful if I got something in writing, some sort of confirmation. I mean, I got this brief email saying this is what Amy said, but I would prefer to have something a bit more tangible from head office that says, yes, we're definitely going to go do that. There was then a series of meetings, as I understand it, between Miss Bell, I think Mr Carr, and maybe somebody from HR, and I think possibly even KPMG, where the advice was being discussed. And then I was told, despite what they said to me on the 14th of February, maybe it wasn't going to go ahead that way, or if it did go ahead that way, then it might be done a different way, which was going to provide changes in the tax registers. It all got very confusing and very difficult. And apparently, all that took place in the 2 weeks, or in the period of time that between Mr Cartwright getting the email on the 14th of February and then him seeking the direct intervention of Minister Ayres in March. So I'm going to ask you, do you recall having those meetings between yourself, Mr Carr, somebody from HR and someone from KPMG where you may have reversed your position that you indicated on the 14th of February, sorry?
No, no. My understanding and my recollection was that I certainly told Stephen at some point that the CEO, based on analysis of what had been done elsewhere, was supportive of paying rent. But let me be clear: we pay rent, but we reduce salary in the same that same amount. So it's not necessarily in addition. I don't know that Stephen had found an apartment at that point, so that for it to be relevant. I feel like he may, at that point in time, he'd only just arrived and was in temporary accommodation, and so. But look, if that's Stephen's recollection, I mean, obviously this was more important to Stephen because it's his personal circumstances. If that's his recollection of the dates, certainly the formal documentation and KPMG advice we did not get until, as you say, March, April.
Okay. Can I, before we go to the next matter, I'm just going to ask if my colleagues have any further on that. No? Can I ask you then, let's move forward in time. We've explored both here and in estimates the sort of circumstances as it results to rent, but I want to get through the the approval chain on this. This was taken to Miss Brown, who gave formal approval, correct?
That's correct. Was
Minister Ayres ever briefed on these arrangements to do with the rent and the school fees issues, to the best of your recollection?
Yes, I believe he was.
Can you
largely because of...
Sorry, Ms. Bell.
Yes, sorry, because of the time lag. Look, yes, I believe he was, and I think the main reason he was briefed was because obviously Mr Cartwright had contacted him about the issue, and I believe therefore Mr Ayres or Minister Ayres had forwarded either his message to the CEO, and so at that point certainly the CEO and I, we got external advice. We made contact with other state governments to identify how formally, I mean, we'd made informal investigations before this point, and put together a sort of a document on our proposed way forward, which is the brief that I think you've got evidence of and you've got copies of. But I believe Minister Ayres was briefed informally, not to seek permission, and as the brief shows, that clearly the person that approved the change in contract was the CEO, but I believe that as the Minister by that point had been involved through Mr Cartwright.
What briefings were given to the Minister around June this year?
I was not present in a briefing with the CEO's briefing to the Minister, so I can't speak to that other than confirmation from the CEO that the Minister had been briefed informally. He was in no way a deciding authority or delegate on any decision that the CEO would make, but she had let Minister Ayres know of the outcomes of our research, and that I understood, was comfortable, but it was Amy's and the CEO's decision to make.
Sure, but Ms Brown told you that?
I believe My recollection is yes, she did, and I believe the reason why Minister Ayres, I guess, had been involved now purely was because Mr. Cartwright had messaged him, and so I guess the message had gone to the Minister, and so I believe she just let the Minister know what had happened so that that issue had been closed off.
And do you recall, did you recall informing Mr. Cartwright that Minister Ayres had agreed to this?
Yeah, I've seen that email, and that's a really unfortunate use of words on my behalf, probably sent very late at night. I guess at that point I was concerned that Mr. Cartwright might continue to...
What email are you referring to, Ms Bell?
Sorry? I
email?
think I saw it. I feel like I sent an email to Stephen after the agreement was... what's the right word? After the agreement from the CEO with a new... What's the word? A new contract?
The contract variation was executed?
Sorry, I'm a bit foggy. The contract variation had been signed off or been sent to Stephen. I believe he wrote back and inquired at that point about education and school fees. And I recall writing to Stephen because this was not captured in the contract variation, because at that point his children did not require school fees. And I believe I wrote back. I think my intent was to just...
Well, did you write back that... let's just work through this. Ms Brown informs you that she had briefed the Minister, and the Minister had, in effect, agreed, albeit he wasn't the actual decision maker.
I feel like that's too strong a word, agreed, because it implies that he is the decision maker.
Well,
I believe that the CEO simply briefed...
Well, what did the CEO tell you?
The CEO told me that she had let the Minister know the outcome of our conversations with Mr. Cartwright.
And what did you... Then did you tell Mr. Cartwright this verbally? Because he recollects various ways in which you communicated this to him.
I believe I communicated it to him verbally, but probably also in an email.
Do you recall when? Verbally?
I'd say the end of June.
Mr. Cabell, it couldn't have been the end of June because you executed this at the start of June.
Yeah, I believe. I believe that when I told him in writing, it was after the agreement had been executed that the Minister had been supportive.
And Ms Bell, do you recall what the CEO told you about the Minister's view about this? Did the Minister approve or disapprove of these arrangements?
Well, I feel like the Minister probably didn't care too much for knowing about these arrangements. I think he's a Minister and probably had more important things to do than Stephen's accommodation.
That's your... yep.
I think
That's not what Mr. Cartwright thought.
I think your focus is...
And incidentally,
on
Ms.
the-
Bell, that's not what we asked.
Yeah, but look, honestly, like I said, I don't think this was in either the CEO or the Minister's view. The CEO didn't think it was that important, is my recollection. Of course, very important to Stephen, but in the scheme of things, not a huge issue that we were dealing with. And so I think it was simply a matter of the CEO had briefed the Minister because he had received correspondence from Stephen. She wanted to close the loop to let the Minister know how we had,
Yep.
where we'd landed. And
So
it was as
that's-
simple as that. I don't think it was...
So you've provided useful context. I'm just going to return to that question about what was conveyed to you about the Minister's view by the CEO. You're saying what was conveyed to you was this wasn't regarded as a big deal by the Minister.
That's, again, not wanting to put words in my mouth, but I feel like it had not been the subject of a formal meeting. It was something that the CEO had discussed with the Minister in passing, and she had probably advised the Minister that we had done a benchmarking exercise, and based on what we'd found, it was quite common for other state governments in the Commonwealth to make a contribution towards rent or school fees, and
Ms. Bell,
I assume he was comfortable with that.
Ms. Bell, he was comfortable with that. Well, that was what the CEO told you.
No, look, again, I don't recall directly the exact conversation,
Then do
I
you,
simply recall that we agreed that based on our findings of the work, that paying and reducing Stephen's salary in return, paying rent and accommodation was not unusual for an expat package, and that the minister had been briefed and didn't seem to have any objections. So I feel like what I'm trying to say is please don't overestimate the involvement of the minister in this.
Well, we're just simply asking you, what do you recall about what you were told of the minister's view? And you've said that the minister didn't have directions but was comfortable with that. Is that your best recollection of what you were told about the minister's view?
That's correct.
okay. And then you conveyed that to Mr. Cartwright both verbally and in writing.
I believe so, yes.
And you recollect that you may have done that at the end of June, not the start of June?
Yeah, so look, because Stephen received in June a contract negotiation, a contract variation, I believe the reason why I communicated it to Stephen in June was because we'd already landed here and he knew that that was the arrangement that we were working towards. I believe he'd had a briefing with KPMG, who we were getting advice from as well. The reason why I feel like I wrote in June was because after
No, we
the
know you
contract-
did. We know you did, Miss Bell, write in June. We're asking you, when did you verbally say it?
Again, this was a conversation we were having every week. Like verbally, probably every weekly meeting that Stephen and I had
Okay,
over that period. This was a standing agenda item for him.
So do you
So it's hard
recall?
to pinpoint an exact date.
But do you recall doing it soon thereafter, after Miss Brown told you about the minister's view?
I feel like the minister's view is very secondary to all of
Miss
this.
Bell, that's not my question.
So I can't pinpoint when the time was, because this was a conversation that I obviously had on a regular basis with Stephen over a 3-month period. And so there would have been ongoing conversations about it. I feel like the minister was raised purely not because necessarily we cared. That this was not the minister's decision to make.
Miss Bell,
But I feel like the minister's involvement, my use of my reference to the minister came when, after we had provided Stephen with a contract variation, he then asked about education and said,
Miss Bell, respectfully,
Education.
Point of order.
that
Yeah.
doesn't
Please let her
align.
finish.
Miss Bell, that doesn't align at all with the evidence that Mr. Cartwright has given all the documents. So let me take you through them.
sure.
Do you mind turning to the Stephen Cartwright tender bundle that is dated 2/11/2022 and specifically to page 87?
Mine's only got page 50, so I don't know if I've got
It's the other
right.
one. It's the tender bundle. There's 2 tender bundles for Mr. Cartwright. I hope you've been provided with both, which I think you have.
Yeah, sorry, I have.
Yeah.
Thought that was my tender bundle.
Yeah, if you don't mind turning to the Stephen Cartwright 2nd of November 2022, page 87.
Yeah, guess what? Mine finishes at page 74. I
Okay.
feel like my team might not have finished printing.
That's
But
okay.
you told me-
I understand
you
very
told me
much.
through it.
That's okay. I can just
Sorry.
read you. We might just
Yeah.
read you the relevant sections.
Is that okay? Thank you. I'm very sorry.
That's okay, Miss Bell. It's not your fault. Miss Bell, on the 8th of June 2022 at 1:29 p.m, you email Mr. Cartwright and you CC legal counsel and HR personnel, who I won't name, and you say, "Hi Stephen, hope you landed safely and most importantly the move into the new apartment has gone smoothly. Please say signed letter from the CEO to vary your employment agreement with us now paying your rent and wearing the tax implications with a subsequent reduction in your allowances to the same value of rent." You're going to have to take me at my word when I say you sent this email.
I know I did. So that
Great.
was in early June. Yeah.
Yep, that's 8 June. Then you
Yeah, that's
missed
correct.
on the 9th of June at 8:28 p.m, which I believe is Sydney time. Mr. Cartwright replies, "Hi Kylie, I look forward to hearing back from X on the operative date issue. Also, you and I discussed the opportunity for school fees to be paid via the same salary sacrifice method as the rent if they moved over and went to school here. I recall that the Minister agreed to this. However, this draft specifically prohibits this in the future." Now, I pushed Mr. Cartwright quite specifically on this matter multiple times. He has a direct recollection that you told him that the Minister had in fact agreed to the arrangement around school fees to take place should he decide to relocate his children to the UK. Specifically, the Minister agreeing around the issues of school fees. Now, Mr. Cartwright has no dispute about his recollection. He has a clear recollection, and to be fair to Mr. Cartwright, his version of events align very closely to this timeline in which he does that. So I'm going to ask you, do you recall telling Mr. Cartwright that the Minister had in fact agreed to this arrangement with respect to school fees?
Yes, as I said, I do recall. I thought it was in June, but I certainly do. I'm sorry, as I mentioned, I certainly do recall telling Stephen that the Minister was comfortable with school fees, and that whether that was, as I said, whether that was in June, May, Stephen and I were having regular conversations on this topic. In my mind, for probably 3 months. So, and certainly my understanding is that Minister Ayres was briefed on this as early as April. So absolutely that timeline could and probably does hold true.
Thank you, Ms. Belden.
Sorry, I'm a little foggy, but I get what you're saying.
So you do recall specifically briefing, informing Mr. Cartwright that the Minister was comfortable with such an arrangement applying around school fees?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And then, so bear in mind, Mr. Cartwright's evidence is that the reason why he had to prompt you about this was because the written contract variation explicitly made clear that the arrangement did not apply to school fees, despite the private arrangement that he felt he had with you.
So first up, I don't think it's a private arrangement. So the contract variation was very specific. We could only do a contract variation when we had actual costs. And in Mr. Cartwright's case, at that point in time, his children weren't seeking the reimbursement of school fees or the payment of school fees. So it's hypothetical. I can't reimburse something or change his contract for a dollar amount if we don't have said dollar amount or those arrangements are not in place. But we were able to do the contract variation because we had a very specific amount, which was the rent we were going to pay, and therefore the exact amount that we would be deducting from Stephen's salary. And so I think the point I was trying to make to Stephen was we have agreed in principle that in the future we would cover these costs if required, but of course the contract variation could not have those figures
Yes.
purely because it's a hypothetical situation.
At that point,
And that was the point I was trying to make to Stephen, was that we have agreed, and even the Minister is comfortable with this, when the time comes and if your children do require to be educated in the UK, we will do a future contract variation at that point in time.
Thank you, Ms. Bell. That does sort of align with what the written record shows. I've only got 2 more questions before I pass to my colleague on this. But on the 12th of June 2022, which is a Sunday, at 1:17 p.m, you send an email to Mr. Cartwright. Sorry, just to take you through the full chain.
Thank you.
In response to Mr. Cartwright's email from the 9th of June, in which he says, also you and I discussed the opportunity for school fees to be paid via the same salary sacrifice method. I recall the Minister agreed to this. You formally reply to him and go, however, as agreed, next year, if the children are with you in the UK and you require us to pay schooling directly from your base salary as agreed, a new letter will be issued with a specific amount for fees, and your base salary will be further reduced by the same amount, and a new letter will be issued confirming the specifics, including the benefits tax that we'll make good on your behalf. Now, to be frank, that's not technically, I wouldn't characterise that as hypothetical, I'd characterise that as conditional. as in conditional upon your children going, this arrangement will be entered into, which, to be fair to Mr Cartwright, he made very clear that the only reason he executed that contract variation was because he had this private correspondence from you. And I just want to be very clear to you, you were comfortable in communicating this to Mr Cartwright because you had the concurrence of the CEO as the decision maker, and you were told that the Minister had no issues with the arrangement, or was comfortable with the arrangement, was your direct words, just to be clear.
To be clear, Stephen seemed to be very worried about what might happen in the future, and these were the benchmarking that I had completed, included both school fees and accommodation. And so I was, at that point, I think, trying to reassure, I think that's the right word to use. I was trying to reassure Stephen that in the future, if those arrangements were to be made, that we would honour our commitment as per the CEO's agreement,
To be fair,
we would enter into those new arrangements.
to fair to you, Ms Bell, you received an email on 16 June from Mr Cartwright, in which it's directed at Ms Brown, for which you are CC'd, in which, amongst other things, that Mr Cartwright says, you will recall that the Minister was very clear that school fees could be dealt with the same way as we're dealing with the rent. So this clause has caused me some concern. However, I've been reassured by Kylie that the Minister did in fact approve this. And he goes on to thank you and the other person for shepherding this through our internal processes, and he thanks Ms Brown for securing the Minister's approval. So just to be very clear here, you did provide the reassurance to Mr Cartwright that the Minister had in fact approved this arrangement, and could another similar variation agreement to cover the fees would be entered into should this become necessary.
Well, I don't know if we responded to Mr Cartwright's email. So obviously he felt that the Minister was the delegate to approve this.
Well, no, to be clear, he says he was reassured by you. He didn't assume that he was a delegate. He was reassured by
and
you.
This is a matter for Stephen's interpretation of the conversations. I mean, the decision was the CEO's, hence the contract variation, and the brief was the CEO's. I feel like, and look, Stephen has mentioned this in his, he's reasonably new to government, but in our head, the decision maker in this was Ms Brown. And in our mind and in the work that we did internally, I simply kept trying to assure Stephen that there was no need for him to continue to try and make contact with the Minister around his package, and that the Minister was comfortable with what we had agreed.
So, but you did reassure him that the Minister had agreed to this?
Predominantly so that he didn't, without causing any disrespect to anyone, predominantly so he didn't feel he needed to go back to a Minister to get clarification on this.
Thank you, Ms Bell. That's helpful.
Great, thank you, Ms Bell. Can I just get you to turn to page 5 of that tender bundle that relates to you?
One sec. I'm just doing that.
And this is the email from Mr Cartwright to you, referring to some of those comparable positions.
Wait. Would you like me to comment on it, or just review it?
Not at this
I think
point.
this basically is probably...
Ms Bell, the answer to that question is no. I was going to ask you some specific questions about it. When did Mr Cartwright actually move from temporary accommodation and find an apartment? It's around this time, is it the 23rd of March?
No. So because Mr Cartwright, so the relocation package that each of our sticks gets allows for 3 months temporary accommodation.
Yep.
So February, March, April. I believe he then did a trip to Australia, and I believe moved into the apartment in June.
Great. And this email chain refers to a specific apartment. Is that the apartment that he ended up settling in when he moved from temporary accommodation?
Can you just give me a few minutes to just read through the note? I don't know that if it, in March, I honestly don't know if apartments he was looking at in March were the ones that was where he finally ended up.
If you turn to page 9, that might be helpful. You can see here that what's triggered this exchange of emails is the fact that he's accepted an offer he's made an offer overnight and it has been
Yes,
accepted
sorry,
on this.
that's correct. So
apartment.
the apartment it referred to in this email chain is the apartment he ended up moving into, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Or within that complex. Whether it's the exact apartment, I'm not clear.
And turning back to that page 5, you can see that in his correspondence with you, he refers to a small 2-bedroom apartment that's in the table there, and then to the modest rent that he's paying. Do you agree there are 2 references there in this email?
Yes, I understand the apartment is 2-bedroom.
Yep.
And he probably does make reference.
Well, it's just keep on coming.
Yeah, just in that second last paragraph, he makes reference to the modest rent.
Yes.
And we know from his evidence and from his emails that there was an agreement, he believed, between Minister Barilaro and Minister Perrottet about the accommodation being in an inner suburb of London that might be taken care of by the New South Wales Government. What is the suburb in which this apartment is located in London?
Are you asking me? I don't know London. So,
I'm asking, do you know the suburb? The agreement between the Treasurer, Perrottet, and Minister Barilaro, Deputy Premier Barilaro, was that Mr Cartwright will be located in an inner suburb of London. What is the suburb that Mr Cartwright has been located in? Are you aware?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware.
What's the street?
Great,
It's
thank you.
maybe included here, but even if I was aware, I wouldn't necessarily know where that's located in
Thank
London.
you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Look, thanks, Ms Bell. I've got 2 quick questions. The first is, there was a lot of work done through the entire process, and we've seen this through the mountains of documents that we've looked at through this inquiry, of getting the advice about what the right balance of payments were for these stick positions. Why is it that the Agent General and Mr Cartwright have had a very bespoke and ongoing negotiation over these arrangements, given that these things were benchmarked within the public service and with the work from KPMG?
Between the judges.
I can only talk to, obviously, the piece of work that I did with the CEO and the team in February. In my head, look, London is an expensive place to live, as are a number of the locations that we've selected overseas.
Tokyo and New York are not cheap either. Yep.
The Agent General role was the first, and so therefore sometimes there's teething issues with, I guess the first time is the first time anyone's ever done something like this within the New South Wales Government, so things perhaps are a little bit more complicated with the first one, and then each one subsequently becomes a little bit easier.
So it had nothing to do, this is my final question, so at any point did yourself or the CEO or others remind the ministers that you'd been through these other processes and that what Mr Cartwright was asking for was completely outside the arrangements of all of what was anticipated with all of the other sticks?
No, so I think when we looked at this in February, it simply was looking at it as a matter of, I guess, lessons learned, and was the way that it had been set up the right way, or is there something we as the New South Wales Government can learn from how the Commonwealth does this? They've been doing it for hundreds of years and do it much more frequently than we do, and learning from other state governments. So the point at that point in time was really doing a bit of a stock take and looking at how it worked and whether we should do things differently.
And so do you anticipate that as a result of the arrangements...
Nothing from us.
Yeah, okay.
I've just got, well, actually I've got one. Okay, do one from us.
Ms Sharp, are you okay? Because we did start a couple of minutes late, so you're fine. Okay. Ms Bell, we'll just move to questions from government members, if there are any. Mr Fang.
Ms Bell, the only question I want to put to you is that given the extreme upset that the opposition seems to put forward, that they have a great objection to the tax implications to the New South Wales public, in relation to the rent, which, as you indicated in your answers, is actually what is generally adopted by most of the overseas postings that other states and also Austrade have. Would it surprise you that the ongoing cost of this exercise, in this now being the 12th hearing of this inquiry, would surpass many multiples over the cost to the New South Wales public to continue digging through these documents
Can I ask a public servant that?
Presented to you today?
Yeah.
Point of order. I think that's actually out of order in terms of what you ask a public servant. This is asking for an opinion.
I'm pretty sure that's what Ms Bell would potentially respond with.
Oh, okay. That's all right.
I have no comment.
Thank you, Ms Bell.
As in,
That's fine. Thank you, Ms Bell.
The
question was...
You just want to put stuff on Hansard. We know what you're doing.
Completely. Okay, with that final question, we will declare this hearing closed. Thank you again, Ms Bell, for making yourself available at this time. The committee really appreciates it. I understand, order. It is difficult for Ms Bell to hear when we've got laughing over from the side. It is, I understand you did take some questions on notice, so the Secretariat will be in touch with you about that. So thank you once again, and that is the end of our hearing today.
Oh, is it? Oh, it's a shame.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.